Tonight, we uncover the hidden history of names whispered in fear, written in secrecy, and preserved behind the stone walls of the Vatican. Names that Christians have called demons for centuries, but whose true origins stretch back through lost texts, mistranslations, and centuries of careful copying. The story is not about fire and brimstone, but about ink, parchment, and the quiet control of knowledge that shaped what believers could see, speak, or even imagine. Some names trace back to Hebrew scriptures, others to Greek spirits, still others to legends forged in the minds of medieval scholars. But each one survived only because it was recorded, studied, and sanctioned by those who controlled the libraries, the exorcism manuals, and the words of authority itself. And what about the texts that were never allowed to circulate, the manuscripts condemned, hidden, or erased entirely? They hold fragments of truth about a spiritual world carefully catalogued, ranked, and transmitted for over 1,000 years. Those who tried to trace the origins of these names risked censorship, ridicule, and in some cases, erasure from the record entirely. Tonight, we will journey through manuscripts, ritual manuals, hagiographies, and archives to reveal how Christian demon names were born, preserved, and controlled us. So before you drift too far into the shadows, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. A name should not be able to frighten a civilization. Yet in Christianity, names of demons became symbols of fear, authority, and control. This was not how it began. In the earliest centuries of the Church, Christians did not inherit a clear list of evil beings with fixed identities. They inherited fragments, languages, and ancient beliefs that were slowly reshaped into something far more rigid. Understanding how demon names entered Christian vocabulary reveals that names mattered as much as belief itself, because a named enemy is easier to define, confront, and command. In the earliest Christian writings, especially the Gospels written between the 1st and early 2nd centuries, demons are rarely identified by personal names. They are called unclean spirits or evil spirits. This was intentional. Early Christians came from Jewish traditions, where spiritual danger was described in general terms rather than personal identities. In Hebrew scripture, hostile forces were often roles or conditions, not named personalities. Naming carried power, and power was treated carefully. As Christianity spread through the Greek-speaking world, this restraint began to shift. Greek culture already used the word daemon to describe spiritual beings that were neither purely good nor purely evil. When early Christian thinkers translated their ideas into Greek, they redefined daimones as hostile forces opposed to God. This linguistic shift planted the seed for later demon naming. Once a term existed, identity followed. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, church writers faced a growing problem. Christians lived among people who worshipped old gods, practiced magic, and invoked spirits by name. To argue against these practices, Christian leaders began to explain them. Explaining required labeling. Pagan gods were reframed as demons, and ancient spirit names were absorbed into Christian teaching, not as rivals, but as defeated enemies. Naming them weakened them, at least in theory. Names also became tools of authority. In the ancient world, knowing a spirit's name meant claiming power over it. This idea existed in Jewish, Greek, and Roman traditions long before Christianity. As exorcism practices developed, church leaders debated whether naming spirits gave too much attention to them or stripped them of power. The tension remained unresolved, but the names stayed. By the time Christianity became legally recognized in the early 4th century, the shift was complete. The Church did not simply fight evil, it categorized it. Once copied into Latin texts and repeated in sermons, these names hardened into tradition. What began as linguistic translations and polemical arguments slowly became fixed identities. This is why some demon names feel ancient, yet appear late in history. They are not fossils from the beginning of Christianity. They are constructions shaped by language, theology, and authority. The name should not exist because it was never meant to. It exists because once a belief is named, it can be taught, controlled, and remembered. The earliest archives preserved these developments quietly, ensuring later generations inherited names that felt eternal, even though their origins were shaped by debate, translation, and institutional need alone today. Before Christianity defined demons as named enemies, the ancient Mediterranean world already believed in unseen forces, but they were understood very differently. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, hostile spirits existed as conditions of nature, illnesses, or disruptions in daily life, rather than as organized personalities opposing a single god. These cultures did not share a unified concept of evil beings locked in cosmic rebellion. Instead, spirits were part of a crowded, invisible world that could help, harm, or simply exist alongside humanity. In ancient Mesopotamia, dating back to the 3rd millennium before Christ, texts describe spirits that caused sickness, nightmares, or misfortune. Names like Lamashtu or Pazuzu appear, but they functioned more as explanations for danger than moral enemies. These beings weren't symbols of absolute evil. They were forces to be avoided, appeased, or countered with ritual. Protection mattered more than judgment. The same pattern appears in ancient Egypt, where spirits of the dead, wandering beings, and protective entities filled religious life. Harmful spirits existed, but they were not framed as rebels against a supreme divine order. In the Greek world, the concept of daimones shaped how people understood invisible beings. A daemon was a spirit that could guide, mislead, inspire, or warn. Philosophers like Plato spoke of daimones as intermediaries between gods and humans. They were morally mixed, not purely evil. Even when a daimon caused harm, it was often seen as fulfilling a role rather than acting with malicious intent. There was no single enemy to fear, only balance to maintain. Roman religion absorbed these ideas and focused heavily on household spirits, local forces, and protective entities. Spirits were connected to places, families, and events. When something went wrong, it was not because a named demon plotted against humanity, but because harmony had been broken. Ritual restored order. Fear existed, but it was practical, not cosmic. What is important is what these cultures lacked. There was no unified hierarchy of evil spirits. There was no centralized list of names taught to the population. Knowledge of spirits was local, flexible, and often private. A spirit known in one region meant nothing in another. This made the ancient world spiritually crowded, but not controlled by a single narrative. When Christianity emerged in the 1st century, it entered this environment. Early Christians inherited a world filled with spirits, but they rejected its complexity. To promote a single truth, the Church needed a simpler enemy. Over time, the many spirits of the Mediterranean were compressed into the idea of demons. What had once been scattered explanations for misfortune became symbols of opposition to God. This transformation did not happen overnight. It required translation, debate, and authority. Ancient spirits weren't born as demons. They were reclassified. Understanding this reveals something crucial. Christian demonology did not arise from nowhere. It was built by reshaping older beliefs into a form that could be taught, remembered, and controlled, turning a diverse spirit world into a defined category called demons. The Hebrew Bible presents one of the most misunderstood foundations of later Christian demonology, not because it clearly describes demons, but because it does not. In its original language, the Hebrew scriptures contain only a handful of vague terms that later readers would come to associate with demons. Words such as Shedim and Seirim appear rarely, and when they do, they are not explained, named, or organized into any system of evil. Instead, they function as references to foreign worship, wilderness dangers, or poetic imagery. The problem began not with what the text said, but with how it was later translated and interpreted. The term Shedim appears in Deuteronomy and Psalms, describing sacrifices offered to entities that are not God. In context, these passages criticize idolatry, not supernatural beings with identities. Shedim likely referred to foreign gods or powerless spirits associated with other cultures. They were not portrayed as enemies plotting against humanity, but as empty objects of worship that distracted people from Israel's God. The word Seirim appears in prophetic and poetic texts, often translated as goat-like beings or desert creatures. In ancient Near Eastern imagery, wild places symbolized chaos and danger. These references evoked fear of the unknown rather than belief in named demons. No hierarchy, personality, or moral rebellion is described. These terms were intentionally ambiguous, serving rhetorical and theological purposes rather than building a demonology. The shift occurred during translation. When Jewish scriptures were translated into Greek in the Septuagint around the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, translators faced a challenge. Greek already had the concept of daimones. To communicate unfamiliar Hebrew ideas, translators often chose familiar Greek words. Shedim became daimones. Seirim became beings associated with spirits. This linguistic choice carried unintended consequences. Daimones in Greek culture already implied invisible spiritual entities, and when Christian writers later inherited these translations, the meanings hardened. By the time Latin translations emerged, especially the Vulgate in the late 4th century, the interpretive gap widened further. Jerome translated through layers of meaning shaped by theology rather than original context. What began as poetic or polemical language became evidence of hostile spirits. Readers no longer encountered ambiguous terms. They encountered demons. This mattered deeply. Once a word is translated as demon, readers assume intent, identity, and opposition. Over centuries, commentary replaced context. Church scholars read these passages not as critiques of idolatry or metaphors of chaos, but as confirmations that demons existed long before Christianity. The original ambiguity was lost. The Hebrew Bible did not offer names, ranks, or narratives of rebellion. Translation nudged it in that direction. This is why many demon names feel rooted in ancient scripture, even when the scripture itself never described them. The transformation was not deliberate deception. It was the result of language crossing cultures, theology filling gaps, and authority deciding which meanings endured. The demon emerged not fully formed, but translated into existence through words alone. Lilith is often spoken of as if she stepped fully formed out of ancient scripture. yet her presence in early biblical tradition is barely visible. In the Hebrew Bible, there is only a single, highly debated reference in the book of Isaiah, written around the 8th century before Christ. The term used is Lilith, appearing in a poetic passage describing desolation and wilderness. In its original context, it likely referred to a night creature or wind spirit associated with abandoned places, not a named demon with personality or intent. There is no story, no dialogue, no role assigned. Lilith begins as a shadow, not a character. The transformation begins outside the Bible. In ancient Mesopotamian mythology, long before Judaism took written form, there existed female night spirits associated with disease, childbirth, and danger. Figures similar to Lilith appear in Akkadian and Sumerian texts dating back to the 3rd millennium before Christ. These beings were not moral villains. They represented fear tied to the night, infancy, and the unknown. When Jewish culture developed in close contact with Mesopotamian societies during periods of exile, fragments of these ideas entered later Jewish thought. By the time of the Second Temple period, roughly between the 5th century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ, Jewish literature expanded beyond Scripture. In texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls and later rabbinic writings, Lilith begins to take shape. She becomes associated with the night, with danger to newborns, and with isolation outside human society. Still, she is not yet the demon known today. She functions as a warning symbol rather than a central evil figure. The most dramatic change occurs much later, in medieval Jewish texts such as the alphabet of Ben Sira, likely written between the 8th and 10th centuries after Christ. Here, Lilith is given a narrative. She is described as Adam's first wife, created equal, who refuses submission and leaves Eden. This story does not appear in the Bible. It emerges from folklore, interpretation, and social commentary. Lilith becomes a symbol of rebellion, independence, and threat to order. Her name now carries meaning beyond poetry. When Christianity encountered these later Jewish traditions, the context shifted again. Medieval Christian writers were not interested in folklore as metaphor. They sought moral clarity. Lilith was absorbed into Christian demonology as a demon associated with lust, temptation, and chaos. Her origins as a vague night spirit were forgotten. Her story was flattened into a warning against disorder and disobedience. What makes Lilith important is not just who she became, but how she became that way. Her evolution shows how a single word can accumulate centuries of fear, interpretation, and authority. The Church did not invent Lilith from nothing. It inherited fragments, selected meanings, and reinforced one version until it felt ancient and fixed. Lilith's long road from desert imagery to named demon reveals a pattern repeated across demonology. Names survive because institutions preserve them. Stories endure because they serve a purpose. What began as a whisper in the desert night became a permanent figure in Christian imagination, not because Scripture demanded it, but because tradition shaped it into something that could no longer be ignored. The Book of Enoch represents one of the most influential yet officially excluded sources behind later Christian demonology. Written and compiled during the Second Temple period between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ, these texts expand a brief and mysterious passage from Genesis about the sons of God and the daughters of men. Where the Hebrew Bible remains silent, Enoch speaks in detail. It names the watchers describes their rebellion and explains the origin of destructive spirits in a way that would shape religious imagination for centuries. In the Enochic tradition, the Watchers are heavenly beings assigned to observe humanity. Instead of remaining distant, they descend to earth, take human wives, and teach forbidden knowledge. Their names are carefully listed. Figures such as Shemihaza and Asael are no longer vague forces but identifiable leaders. This is one of the earliest moments where evil is personalized and named in a structured way. The rebellion is not symbolic, it is deliberate and organized. The offspring of this union are the Nephilim, giants who devastate the earth. When they are destroyed, their spirits are said to remain, becoming wandering entities that afflict humanity. This idea is critical. It introduces a direct origin for evil spirits without making them fallen angels themselves. These spirits are restless, violent, and harmful. They are not yet called demons in the later Christian sense, but the framework is unmistakable. What makes the Book of Enoch so important is how widely it circulated. Fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing that these ideas were known and valued by certain Jewish communities. Early Christians were also familiar with them. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament directly references Enoch, quoting its language about judgment. This confirms that Enochic ideas influenced early Christian thought, even if the text itself was later excluded from the biblical canon. Over time, church authorities grew cautious. The Book of Enoch raised difficult questions. It suggested that heavenly beings could rebel, that forbidden knowledge played a role in human suffering, and that evil spirits had a clear origin story outside standard doctrine. By the 4th century after Christ, as Christian theology became more centralized, Enoch was quietly set aside. It was not destroyed, but it was no longer promoted. Despite this exclusion, its influence remained. Names, hierarchies, and explanations from Enoch filtered into later demonology through commentaries, folklore, and theological debate. The Watchers became precursors to fallen angels. Their offspring became the foundation for understanding demonic spirits. Later writers rarely cited Enoch directly, but they inherited its structure. This is why demon names feel ancient and detailed. They come from a period when religious imagination was expanding beyond Scripture, filling gaps left by silence. The Book of Enoch did not survive in official canon, but it survived in memory. Through it, demon lore gained names, origins, and narratives that would echo through centuries of Christian thought, long after the text itself was pushed into the shadows. Azazel is one of the clearest examples of how a single word can change meaning over time until it becomes something entirely different. In the Hebrew Bible, Azazel appears in the book of Leviticus, written many centuries before Christ, during the description of the Day of Atonement ritual. 2 goats are chosen. One is sacrificed to God, the other is sent into the wilderness for Azazel. The text does not explain what Azazel is. It does not describe a being, a demon, or a personality. It simply states that the goat is sent away, carrying the sins of the people into the desert. Early Jewish interpretation treated Azazel not as a person, but as a concept. Some scholars understood it as a rough or desolate place. Others saw it as a symbolic term, meaning complete removal. The ritual focused on separation. Sin was taken out of the community and returned to chaos. No fear of a named enemy appears in the text. There is no dialogue, no rebellion, and no moral struggle. Azazel functions as a destination, not an adversary. The shift begins during the Second Temple period. As Jewish thought expanded, writers began to explore the wilderness as a spiritual space. Deserts were places of danger, isolation, and testing. In texts like the Book of Enoch, written between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ, Azazel becomes more defined. He is portrayed as a leader among the Watchers who teaches forbidden knowledge to humanity. He is punished by being bound and cast into the wilderness. The ritual space becomes personal. Azazel is no longer a place, he is a being. This reinterpretation changes everything. The scapegoat ritual is reread through this new lens. The goat is no longer just removing sin, it is delivering it back to a rebellious entity associated with corruption. Over time, this reading gains influence, even though it is not stated in the original biblical text. Commentary replaces context. When Christianity inherited Jewish scripture through Greek and Latin translations, the ambiguity hardened further. Translators and theologians were more comfortable with clear moral figures than abstract symbols. Azazel fit neatly into an emerging demonology. He became associated with Satan's domain, the wilderness, and rebellion against God. By the medieval period, Azazel was firmly treated as a demon name. What is striking is that none of this requires altering the original text. It requires interpretation layered upon interpretation. A ritual term becomes a symbolic figure. A symbolic figure becomes a named being. A named being becomes a demon taught from pulp resembles. This process reveals how theology often grows, not by adding new scripture, but by rereading existing words until they take on new life. Azazel's evolution shows that demon names are not always ancient enemies hiding in scripture. Sometimes they are the result of centuries of explanation trying to make sense of silence. The Vatican and other church institutions preserved these interpretations in manuscripts and teachings. In doing so, they ensured that Azazel would be remembered not as a ritual mystery, but as a personal embodiment of sin, even though the earliest text never required him to exist at all. The figure now called Satan did not begin as the ruler of evil or the enemy of humanity. In the earliest layers of the Hebrew Bible, written many centuries before Christ, the word Satan is not a name at all. It is a role. In Hebrew, it means accuser or adversary. It describes a function within a divine court, not a rebellious being acting against God. This original meaning is crucial because it shows that Satan was not born as a character, but slowly written into one. The clearest example appears in the Book of Job, one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible. Here, the Satan appears among the sons of God, questioning human righteousness. He does not rebel. He does not rule over evil forces. He acts with permission, testing rather than opposing. He is more like a prosecutor than a villain. There is no personal name, no origin story, and no cosmic war. The role exists to challenge, not to overthrow. This begins to change during the Second Temple period, roughly between the 5th century before Christ and the 1st century after Christ. Jewish communities were living under foreign rule and wrestling with suffering, injustice, and unanswered questions. Ideas about evil became more developed. Influenced by texts like the Book of Enoch and other apocalyptic writings, the adversary role started to merge with rebellion narratives. The Satan was no longer just accusing humans. He was increasingly associated with opposition to God's plan. When Christianity emerged, this shift accelerated. Early Christians read Jewish scripture through the lens of Jesus' teachings and their belief in a coming judgment. In the New Testament, written in the 1st century, Satan appears more frequently and more clearly as a tempter and opponent. In the Gospels, he tests Jesus in the wilderness. He is no longer just performing a task, he is resisting God's purpose. Still, even here, Satan is not described as ruling an organized kingdom of demons. That image comes later. As Christianity spread through the Greek and Roman world, theological needs changed. The Church sought clear explanations for evil, suffering, and temptation. A defined enemy made teaching simpler. Over the centuries, especially after Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, Satan was transformed into a singular adversary. He absorbed older ideas from pagan gods, rebellious watchers, and hostile spirits. Many figures that once stood alone were reinterpreted as servants or extensions of Satan. By the medieval period, Satan had become the center of an expanding demonology. Demon names clustered around him as part of a hierarchy. This structure reflected human institutions more than ancient scripture. Kingdoms, ranks, and offices were projected onto the spiritual world. Satan became king, not because the Bible clearly stated it, but because the system demanded a ruler. This evolution shows that Satan is less a discovery and more a construction. A role became a character became a symbol, and around that symbol, names multiplied. Understanding this process reveals that Christian demonology did not emerge fully formed. It was shaped over time, preserved in texts, and reinforced by authority until the accuser became the adversary that later generations assumed had always been there. In ancient Greece, the word daimon did not mean evil. Daimones were spirits or intermediaries that could influence human life in many ways. They were not inherently hostile. Philosophers like Plato and Socrates described daimones as messengers between gods and humans, capable of guidance, inspiration, or warning. These spirits were morally ambiguous, sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, but rarely malevolent in the sense later Christianity would define. They were part of a spiritual ecosystem, not soldiers in a cosmic war. Greek literature and philosophy treated daimones as natural aspects of the universe. Poetry, drama, and myth depicted spirits causing disease, misfortune, or confusion, but always as part of a broader balance. A daemon might bring misfortune, but it could also protect or enlighten. The idea of absolute evil simply did not exist in Greek thought. Morality was human-centered, and spirits reflected human experience rather than cosmic rebellion. When Christianity began spreading in the 1st century after Christ, it encountered a world saturated with these beliefs. Greek-speaking Jews and Hellenistic pagans understood spirits in a flexible way. Early Christian writers had to communicate familiar ideas in their own terms. In translating Hebrew scripture into Greek, especially in the Septuagint between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, translators often chose daemon to represent Hebrew terms for unclean or hostile spirits. This choice was not neutral. It imported a culturally specific term into a new theological framework. Once the term daemon entered Christian discourse, its meaning began to shift. Christian writers reinterpreted it morally. Spirits were no longer morally mixed forces. They were often positioned as hostile to God's will. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, theologians like Justin Martyr and Origen were using daemon to describe demonic opposition, associating it with temptation, possession, and idolatry. Greek audiences were familiar with the term, but Christian teaching narrowed its scope and gave it moral weight. Latin translations amplified this change. Jerome's Vulgate in the late 4th century used demon or demonium to translate Greek and Hebrew terms. This Latin vocabulary reinforced the idea of moral hostility. By the medieval period, the Greek concept of daemon had been fully reinterpreted in the Christian imagination. What was once morally neutral or ambiguous became definitively evil, organized, and personal. This transformation illustrates how language shaped belief. Understanding this Greek lens is crucial for tracing demon names. When early Christians inherited Greek texts, they inherited a vocabulary that could be morally coded. Names, stories, and warnings about spirits became more concrete as the abstract flexibility of daimones was lost. The moralization of Greek terms laid the foundation for later Christian demonology. It also explains why many demon names appear in Greek-influenced texts and manuscripts centuries later, showing the long path from philosophical ambiguity to theological certainty. As the Roman Empire declined in the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, Christianity became the official religion, and with it came a dramatic reinterpretation of the pagan past. Roman gods who had once been worshipped across cities and countryside were suddenly recast in a new framework. What had been divinities, tutelary spirits, or household gods were described as demons opposing the one true God. This was not a random accusation. It was a deliberate theological strategy to delegitimize old religions and assert Christian authority. By reframing familiar figures as enemies, church leaders could redefine moral and spiritual order. Roman religion was complex, with countless gods, spirits, and semi-divine beings responsible for agriculture, war, health, and fortune. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and countless minor deities were integrated into daily life. Temples, festivals, and rituals reinforced their presence. When Christianity rose to power, these gods became obstacles. They were no longer neutral or protective. Pagan practices were condemned as idolatry. Writings from church fathers, such as Augustine of Hippo, in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, equated pagan gods with demons, suggesting that these beings weren't divine, but malevolent spirits deceiving humanity. This reinterpretation relied heavily on earlier Jewish and Hellenistic concepts. Just as the Greek daimones had been moralized into demons, Roman deities were reassigned roles as hostile spiritual forces. Christian writers often drew on local knowledge. Rural populations still recognized old gods, and Christian texts labeled them as devils or servants of Satan, reinforcing the contrast between the church and pagan practices. Naming these beings mattered. Once a god was given a label as a demon, it became easier to warn the faithful, preach against worship, and frame miracles or misfortune as evidence of demonic influence rather than natural events or divine favor. The process was reinforced in sermons, catechisms, and writings from the 5th to the 7th centuries. Texts circulated that catalogued former gods as demons or agents of evil. By the time medieval Europe emerged, Jupiter, Apollo, and Bacchus were no longer honored as celestial patrons. Their names survived only as warning markers, symbols of rebellion against God. In some cases, local spirits or tutelary gods were absorbed into folklore as malicious creatures, retaining a trace of their original identity, while fully integrated into demonology. This reframing also allowed early Christians to explain continuity. Society did not change overnight. People continued rituals, festivals, and beliefs, inherited from Rome. By redefining gods as demons, church authorities provided a moral and theological lens through which these practices could be understood as harmful, misguided, and spiritually dangerous. It established Christianity not just as a religion, but as a moral corrective to a familiar past. Rome's old gods in new masks demonstrate how names, stories, and identities are transformed by power, translation, and interpretation. Pagan divinities did not vanish. They were recast into a demonological framework that would shape centuries of Christian thought, ensuring that even memory of the past served the Church's spiritual and social authority. This strategy made demon names culturally resonant, embedding them in both belief and imagination. In the first few centuries after Christ, the early Church Fathers were not only concerned with teaching doctrine, they were engaged in a war of words. Writing from the 2nd to the 4th centuries, theologians such as Tertullian, Origen, and Augustine debated how Christians should understand spirits, angels, and demons. Names were central to these debates. Identifying a spirit by name was not merely descriptive. It was a statement of authority. If a priest or theologian could name a being, they could assert control over it and teach the faithful how to resist it. Names carried power. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, emphasized that knowledge of demonic names allowed exorcists to confront spirits with precision. A generic accusation against an unclean spirit was less effective than addressing it directly. In Roman North Africa, where Tertullian ministered, many converts came from diverse religious backgrounds. They were familiar with pagan practices in which naming a spirit could summon or command it. Christianity repurposed this idea. Naming demons became a tool of defense rather than ritual invocation. Origen, active in the early 3rd century in Alexandria, further explored the intellectual dimension. He wrote that spirits weren't only obstacles, but also teachers of false knowledge. Understanding their identities, their origins, and their tendencies allowed the Church to educate Christians about deception. Names turned abstract fears into manageable concepts. A named demon could be analyzed, confronted in prayer, and classified within the moral universe the Church defined. Knowledge of names was not about curiosity. It was about maintaining spiritual authority. Augustine, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, argued that naming demons reinforced the Church's moral hierarchy. He noted that spirits opposed to God had structure, and understanding their roles helped clergy guide communities safely. In his Confessions and later works, he repeatedly stressed that precise knowledge of spiritual adversaries distinguished the learned from the ignorant. Authority was not only about preaching scripture, it was about showing mastery over unseen forces. This emphasis on names also created a system of continuity. By recording and repeating demon names, theologians ensured that knowledge could be transmitted across generations. Lists, commentaries, and treatises preserved these identities. Even when the origins of a spirit were vague or borrowed from Jewish or pagan sources, the Church framed them within a moral hierarchy. Names became a bridge between theology, ritual practice, and pedagogy. The faithful learned who to fear, and clergy demonstrated who held knowledge and control. Early Church Fathers understood that naming was not arbitrary. It was a mechanism of authority and power. Spirits were no longer faceless forces. They became characters with defined behaviors, histories, and weaknesses. By controlling language, the Church controlled perception, establishing a framework in which demon names were not just descriptive, but functional. This intellectual and spiritual strategy allowed Christianity to consolidate authority while guiding believers through a complex world of unseen threats, setting the stage for the formalized demonologies of later centuries. The New Testament rarely assigns names to demons, and this absence is intentional. Written between the 1st and early 2nd centuries after Christ, the Gospels focus on unclean or evil spirits rather than personalized adversaries. This reflects both theological priorities and practical concerns of early Christian communities. In Greek, the terms used are pneumata, akatharta, or daimonia, emphasizing impurity and opposition rather than identity. The message was clear. Evil exists. It can harm, but it is subordinate to God and Christ. Naming individual demons was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Mark, Matthew, and Luke describe many exorcisms, yet they seldom provide specific names. The purpose of these accounts is to demonstrate authority over spiritual forces and to show the power of Jesus rather than catalogue demons. When a spirit is described, it is often generalized, referred to as mute, blind, or possessing. This universal approach reinforced the idea that all hostile spirits could be overcome by faith and ritual. A name was irrelevant to the lesson and could distract from the spiritual authority being illustrated. The Gospel of John goes even further, emphasizing cosmic duality between light and darkness rather than individual demonic personalities. By avoiding names, the texts maintain focus on moral and spiritual principles. Believers were instructed to recognize evil through behavior and influence, not by memorizing a list of spirits. Early Christians were more concerned with obedience, ritual, and communal faith than with cataloguing entities. Names would have added specificity that could confuse or mislead new converts. Another reason for anonymity comes from Jewish tradition. Hebrew scriptures often describe unclean spirits without names. Terms such as Shedem and Seirim are ambiguous and appear only sporadically. Early Christians inherited this approach. By focusing on unclean spirits, the Gospels connected the new faith to established Jewish concepts, while avoiding the creation of new entities that might be misunderstood or feared excessively. The anonymity maintained flexibility in interpretation. Practical concerns also played a role. Christianity emerged in a diverse religious environment where Greek, Roman, and local spirits were familiar to the population. Naming demons risked borrowing or legitimizing pagan entities, creating theological confusion. By keeping spirits unnamed, early Christian writers maintained clarity and avoided incorporating foreign mythologies into doctrinal teaching. Authority remained with Christ and the apostles rather than with local spirits. Finally, leaving demons unnamed established a template for future exorcism practice. Priests and clergy could exercise spiritual authority universally. The lesson was that all evil is subordinate to God. Knowledge of the name was unnecessary, and attempting to assign names could give power to the very entities the Church sought to control. Over time, later traditions and apocryphal texts would assign names for structure and hierarchy, but the canonical Gospels preserve the original emphasis. Unclean spirits are defeated not by being catalogued, but by being confronted with faith and authority. By the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, Latin had become the dominant language of Western Christianity. As the Roman Empire fragmented, the Church emerged as the central authority, and with it came the need to standardize liturgy, texts, and theological teaching. This process included decisions about which demon names would be preserved and taught. Latin translations of Greek and Hebrew texts, along with commentaries by church fathers, became the vehicle through which the Christian understanding of evil was stabilized. Names that appeared in manuscripts were copied repeatedly, while those deemed irrelevant or confusing were gradually discarded. The translation of Scripture into Latin, especially through Jerome's Vulgate in the late 4th century, played a pivotal role. Jerome translated Greek and Hebrew terms for spirits using Latin words such as demon or demonium. Some proper names from Jewish traditions, like Azazel or specific watchers from the Book of Enoch, were preserved in commentary, ritual, or hagiography, while others were omitted. Over time, the combination of liturgical repetition and monastic copying ensured that only a relatively small set of demon names circulated widely in Western Europe. Liturgical texts, including exorcism rites and prayers, further reinforced which names were authoritative. By the 7th century, Roman sacramentaries and sacrament books contained lists of spirits to be addressed or invoked during exorcism. These texts were copied across monasteries, and their use in public worship ensured that certain names became familiar to clergy, while others disappeared from collective memory. Standardization was not accidental. It allowed the Church to exercise control over belief and ritual, ensuring consistency across vast regions with diverse local traditions. Monastic scholarship also contributed to the preservation of names. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, Benedictine and later Cluniac monks systematically copied manuscripts, recorded commentary, and annotated glosses. They selected which names and stories to transmit, often prioritizing those that aligned with doctrinal teaching and ecclesiastical authority. Names from folklore or local pagan spirits were sometimes included if they could be framed as cautionary examples of sin, but many faded from use. The result was a canon of demon names embedded in Western Christian thought. The creation of a stable demonological vocabulary served multiple purposes. It reinforced the moral and spiritual authority of clergy, provided a framework for understanding temptation and possession, and allowed the faithful to recognize threats as part of an organized hierarchy of evil. Latin acted as a unifying medium, enabling these concepts to travel from Ireland to Italy, from Spain to Germany, without significant variation. By standardizing names through liturgy, scholarship, and manuscript culture, Latin Christianity ensured that certain figures, such as Satan, Beelzebub, and Azazel, would dominate theological and popular imagination. This process marginalized other names, local spirits, or alternative interpretations. It was a deliberate shaping of memory, showing that authority over words could determine authority over belief. In Western Christianity, the survival of demon names was not random. It was the product of translation, repetition, and control that created a fixed vocabulary for evil. By the 7th and 8th centuries after Christ, stories of saints performing miracles became one of the most powerful ways demon names spread to ordinary believers. Hagiographies, or saintly biographies, recorded exorcisms, visions, and battles with evil spirits in great detail. Unlike Scripture, which often left spirits unnamed, these narratives included specific names to dramatize the saint's victory and emphasize the moral order. When a saint confronted a named adversary and triumphed, the faithful learned not only that demons existed, but which ones were active in the world and how they could be overcome. Texts such as the life of Saint Martin of Tours, written in the 5th century, or the later lives of the saints collected in the 9th and 10th centuries, contain numerous accounts of spirits and demons. In these texts, evil beings are frequently named to highlight their defeat. The act of naming served a pedagogical purpose. Ordinary Christians, many of whom could not read or had limited access to manuscripts, heard these stories in church or at local gatherings. Names became familiar and memorable. They provided a mental map of the spiritual world, showing that saints, and by extension the Church, had authority over specific adversaries. Miracle stories were also adapted for liturgical use. Feasts, sermons, and processions often referenced encounters with demons by name, reinforcing the connection between narrative, ritual, and belief. Clergy used these examples to teach obedience, faith, and vigilance. Naming a demon illustrated the saint's power and provided a framework for understanding evil as organized and personal rather than abstract. This approach helped embed demon names deeply in popular imagination. By the high medieval period, roughly between the 10th and 13th centuries, saintly miracle collections became widely circulated across Europe. Monastic scriptoria copied these texts, while traveling clerics shared stories orally. Even illiterate communities acquired knowledge of named demons through festivals, sermons, and pictorial representations in churches. Art and iconography complemented text. Frescoes, stained glass, and illuminated manuscripts depicted saints confronting specific demons, sometimes labeled with their names. Visual reinforcement ensured that names persisted across generations. This process also standardized which names survived. Saints' victories over particular spirits elevated some names, while others remained obscure or vanished. Texts emphasized the hierarchy of evil and the moral geography of the spiritual world. Repeated association with successful exorcisms gave certain demons prominence in teaching and storytelling. By learning names, believers could conceptualize spiritual danger and understand the stakes of sin, temptation, and faithfulness. Saints and their legends thus became a crucial vector for transmitting demon names beyond scholarly or clerical circles. Naming transformed abstract fear into a concrete, organized spiritual system. Ordinary believers internalized the names as markers of evil to resist, creating a shared vocabulary that reinforced church authority. Through these narratives, demon names moved from obscurity in scripture and commentary into the lived religious experience of medieval Europe, shaping popular understanding of the spiritual landscape for centuries. By the 12th and 13th centuries after Christ, medieval Europe developed a strong intellectual drive to classify, organize, and codify knowledge. This was true not only for theology, natural philosophy, and law, but also for the spiritual world. Just as scholars created lists of sins, virtues, and angelic hierarchies, they began cataloguing demons. This effort was part of a broader scholastic desire to understand the cosmos, both seen and unseen, and to create systems that could be taught, remembered, and referenced consistently. Names, ranks, and characteristics became essential to this process. Scholars such as Peter Lombard, Thomas Aquinas, and later, in the 14th century, scholastics writing commentaries on the sentences, emphasized ordering spiritual entities according to function, origin, and influence. Demon names were grouped, often by hierarchy or by the sins they promoted. Pride, envy, lust, gluttony, and the other vices were linked to specific spirits. These classifications reinforced moral instruction. Believers could understand the dangers of sin through a structured framework. A named demon became more than an abstract threat. It was a personified cause for the failings the Church warned against. Cataloguing also extended to exorcism practice. Manuals for clergy, such as Regulae Exorcistarum, compiled in the 11th and 12th centuries, contained instructions for addressing demons by type and, in some cases, by name. Scholars believed that understanding the precise nature of a spirit improved the effectiveness of ritual. The identification of specific demons allowed clergy to teach the faithful how to resist particular temptations and understand the moral landscape of evil in a concrete way. Names were no longer just literary devices. They were tools of spiritual authority. The fascination with lists and hierarchies reflected the scholastic method itself. Medieval universities, emerging in the late 11th and 12th centuries, emphasized categorization and logical reasoning. Demonology became part of this intellectual culture. Commentaries cross-referenced scripture, apocryphal texts, and saints' lives to establish patterns of influence. By the 14th century, works such as the Pseudo-Dionysian corpus influenced both angelology and demonology, showing that ordering spiritual beings was as important as understanding morality, cosmology, or law. This hunger for catalogues ensured that certain names persisted. Once recorded in authoritative texts, copied in manuscripts, and taught to students, these names became standard across Western Europe. Local or obscure spirits were often absorbed into these hierarchies or forgotten. Scholarly consensus dictated which demon names survived, creating a relatively fixed vocabulary for centuries. The process also reinforced church authority, showing that only educated clergy could properly identify, interpret, and counter spiritual threats. Medieval Europe's approach to demon classification reveals that the proliferation of demon names was not accidental. It was systematic, intellectual, and tied directly to moral and spiritual instruction. By creating ordered catalogues, scholars transformed abstract evil into concrete, teachable entities. Names, ranks, and hierarchies gave believers a framework for understanding the unseen world and reinforced the Church's control over both knowledge and spiritual authority across the continent. Throughout late antiquity and the early medieval period, texts falsely attributed to Solomon played a crucial role in legitimizing demon lists. Solomon, king of Israel in the 10th century before Christ, was renowned for his wisdom and for building the temple in Jerusalem. Jewish and later Christian authors claimed that Solomon possessed knowledge and authority over spirits, angels, and demons. Pseudepigraphal works, such as the Testament of Solomon, written between the 1st and 5th centuries after Christ, presented detailed accounts of named demons, their abilities, and methods for controlling them. By attributing these texts to Solomon, authors provided an air of ancient authority that made the content credible to both clergy and lay audiences. The Testament of Solomon contains instructions for summoning, commanding, and binding spirits. It lists specific names, descriptions, and even the kinds of mischief each demon causes. These texts were not canonical, but the attribution to a biblical king gave them weight. Clergy and scholars who encountered these manuscripts treated them seriously, often incorporating the names and methods into homilies, exorcism manuals, and other spiritual instruction. The result was that pseudepigrapha served as a bridge, transmitting otherwise obscure or local spirits into a standardized demonology. Pseudepigraphal attribution also solved a theological problem. Church authorities needed to reconcile human understanding of evil with divine omnipotence. By claiming that Solomon, chosen by God, commanded demons, writers implied that evil was knowable, categorizable, and controllable within God's plan. The use of Solomon's authority reassured believers that these spirits could be confronted with proper knowledge and ritual. It provided a sanctioned precedent for naming and classifying demons that ordinary scripture did not provide. The influence of these texts persisted throughout the early medieval period. Manuscripts circulated among monastic libraries, and scribes copied the lists with remarkable consistency. Names like Asmodeus, Abezethebu, and Beelzebul appear in multiple versions, cementing their place in Western demonological thought. Even when local traditions varied, the association with Solomon ensured that these names were treated as authoritative. Clergy could cite the king of Israel as a historical precedent, reinforcing both spiritual instruction and institutional authority. By the 12th century, references to Solomon's control over demons appeared in Latin translations, commentaries, and exorcism manuals. These texts shaped the moral and spiritual imagination of believers. Demon names, once confined to pseudepigrapha, became part of teaching, sermon illustrations, and popular understanding. The authority of a biblical figure allowed the Church to legitimize a growing catalogue of spirits without appearing speculative or heretical. Solomon's shadow demonstrates how authors used attribution to ancient, respected figures, validate and preserve demon names. The combination of biblical authority, pseudepigraphal narrative, and monastic scholarship ensured that these names entered the collective memory of Western Christianity. Without this strategic framing, many of the demons that dominate medieval texts might have remained anonymous or forgotten, showing the power of perceived authority in shaping religious knowledge. By the late medieval period, roughly between the 13th and 15th centuries after Christ, a significant increase in magical texts known as grimoires transformed the landscape of demon names in Western Europe. These books, often written in Latin, claimed to teach rituals for summoning, binding, and commanding spirits. Unlike earlier hagiographies or pseudepigrapha, grimoires presented elaborate lists of demons with detailed hierarchies, attributes, and signatures. Names such as Paimon, Belial, and Beuah appear in these texts, and, over time, became accepted as ancient and authoritative, even though their origin was relatively recent. The production of grimoires coincided with a period of intellectual curiosity and concern about heresy. Clerics, scholars, and lay practitioners were interested in spiritual knowledge, and the books provided a way to systematize and codify what was previously oral, local, or fragmentary. The grimoires presented names in a formalized way, giving them weight and plausibility. By assigning consistent spellings, roles, and ranks, authors created the impression of ancient tradition, even when some names were invented or adapted from earlier pseudepigraphal sources. One influential example is the Livre des Esprits, compiled in France in the 15th century, which lists demons in hierarchical order and associates each with specific powers and weaknesses. Similarly, the Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum by Johann Weyer in the 16th century, drawing on these medieval sources, recorded 72 demon names with detailed descriptions. These compilations reinforced the perception that the names were ancient, universal, and authoritative. The process of recording, copying, and referencing these names across manuscripts amplified their legitimacy. Grimoires also reflected the intellectual culture of late medieval Europe. Scholars were obsessed with classification, order, and the retrieval of lost knowledge. By presenting demons as structured, named entities, grimoires appealed to the same desire for organization seen in angelology, moral theology, and natural philosophy. Names became tools for understanding, controlling, and teaching about evil in a comprehensible framework. The repetition of names across texts and regions helped them persist in memory, establishing a standard vocabulary for demons. The influence of these texts extended beyond scholarly circles. Clergy, exorcists, and even laypeople accessed grimoires to understand spiritual threats. Although the Church condemned magic, the knowledge embedded in grimoires often filtered into theological commentary, sermons, and folklore. The formal presentation of names allowed ordinary believers to recognize and conceptualize evil with precision. This process blurred the line between literary invention, folklore, and perceived historical reality. The grimoire boom illustrates how many demon names, now considered ancient, are products of medieval intellectual culture. Authors combined pseudepigraphal inheritance, local traditions, and systematic invention to create lists that sounded authoritative. These names were repeated, copied, and standardized, ensuring their survival. What began as a set of ritual instructions evolved into a canon of demonology. The late medieval grimoires did not merely record knowledge, they created it, shaping the perception of demons for centuries to come. In medieval Europe, manuscripts were copied by hand, and this process introduced errors that sometimes became the foundation for new demon names. Between the 8th and 15th centuries after Christ, scribes worked in monasteries and scriptoria under difficult conditions. They copied texts in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and other languages, often without standardized spelling. A single misreading, miswriting, or misinterpretation could transform a phrase into a proper name. Over time, these errors were repeated in subsequent copies, giving them permanence and authority. Translation drift also played a major role. Hebrew terms like shadim or seirim were rendered into Greek as daimonia and then into Latin as daemonia. Each translation introduced subtle shifts in meaning and pronunciation. A word that initially described an unclean or hostile spirit could, through misreading or reinterpretation, emerge as a proper name. By the 13th century, scribes copying exorcism manuals or pseudepigraphal texts might treat a miswritten term as an independent entity, further solidifying its presence in the textual tradition. A notable example comes from the Testament of Solomon and other pseudepigraphal works. Some names, appearing only once or in obscure passages, were copied incorrectly in Latin manuscripts. Over generations, these corrupted forms were treated as legitimate demon names. The repetition of errors across multiple manuscripts gave them a veneer of authenticity, even though their origins were accidental. Scholars and clergy reference these names in exorcisms, commentaries, and teaching, unaware that they had arisen from mistakes rather than tradition. This process was amplified by the structure of monastic learning. Monks were trained to memorize and recite names from authoritative sources. If a miscopied name appeared in a frequently used manuscript, it was internalized and transmitted orally as well as in writing. The more a name was repeated, the more it seemed authoritative. By the late medieval period, many of these names had entered demonological catalogues, grimoires, and miracle stories, indistinguishable from names derived from intentional invention or scripture. The consequences of copying errors extended beyond names themselves. They shaped the perception of the spiritual world. A demon with a unique, exotic-sounding name appeared more real and threatening. It could be assigned specific characteristics, powers, or roles in exorcism manuals and saintly narratives. Names that began as scribal accidents became embedded in theological teaching, folklore, and ritual practice. The transformation of errors into demons illustrates the fragile transmission of knowledge in pre-modern Europe. Handwriting, translation, and human error created lasting effects. What began as a mistake became canonized in the imagination of clergy and laity. Manuscripts were not merely passive carriers of information, they actively shaped belief. By the 15th century, many demon names were the product of centuries of copying, translating, and repeating, showing how mistakes could become myth and solidify the authority of the Church over spiritual knowledge. By the 15th and 16th centuries after Christ, texts known as Goetic grimoires formalized the hierarchy of demons in ways that closely mirrored medieval political systems. These books, including the Lesychy of Solomon or Lemegeton, presented structured lists of demons with ranks such as kings, dukes, princes, marquises, and counts. The classification was detailed, specifying the number of legions each commanded, their powers, and even their manners of address. This hierarchical structure was not accidental. Medieval society itself was highly organized, with clearly defined roles in monarchy, nobility, and church governance. And authors of grimoires borrowed these familiar frameworks to make the spiritual world intelligible and enforceable. The idea of bureaucracy applied to the infernal realm gave demons an appearance of order and accountability. If spirits could be ranked and commanded, they became manageable through ritual. Clerics, scholars, and magicians could conceptualize exorcisms or spiritual warfare using terms and structures they already understood from earthly governance. Kings issued orders, dukes supervised regions, and legions followed commands in both human and demonology analogues. This familiarity made the supernatural world more accessible and reinforced the authority of those who possessed ritual knowledge. Goetic texts combined earlier traditions, including pseudepigrapha, saintly miracle accounts, and classical demonology, into a systematic framework. Names that had previously circulated individually were grouped into functional hierarchies. This organization reinforced the perception that the infernal realm was real and operative, but also contained and constrained by divine authority. By structuring demons into bureaucratic orders, authors could depict spiritual conflict as a mirror of earthly political experience, allowing laypeople and clergy to comprehend abstract metaphysical threats in practical terms. The proliferation of these hierarchies also reinforced clerical authority. Only those trained in ritual and scripture could read, understand, and manipulate these ranks. Ordinary believers were taught to fear demons and respect the mediating power of clergy. Naming, ranking, and describing legions gave church-approved knowledge a sense of precision. This mirrored secular administration, where literacy and access to records determined political power and influence. Knowledge of the infernal bureaucracy became another form of expertise controlled by religious authorities. Goetic hierarchies were not uniform across Europe. Variations appeared in manuscripts from Italy, France, and Germany, but the basic framework of ordered ranks remained consistent. Kings occupied the top, followed by dukes and counts, reflecting hierarchical concepts familiar from monarchical and feudal governance. Each demon's function, attributed vice, or specialty, mirrored administrative divisions and duties in the human world. This systematization allowed spiritual threat to be taught, recorded, and transmitted efficiently across regions. The creation of infernal bureaucracies demonstrates the interplay between human imagination and social structure. Demon names, ranks, and legions were not merely fanciful inventions. They were shaped by the context of medieval political thought, clerical authority, and the need to teach about evil in a comprehensible manner. By giving demons offices and hierarchies, the Church and authors of grimoires established control over the spiritual imagination, ensuring that named adversaries were not only feared, but understood within an organized, authoritative framework. The survival of demon names in Western Christianity owes far more to libraries than to secret magic or occult practices. From the 4th century after Christ onward, the Vatican and other ecclesiastical centers became repositories for manuscripts, commentaries, and ritual texts. Monastic orders, particularly Benedictines, Franciscans, and later Jesuits, systematically collected, copied, and preserved works that contained names of spirits, angels, and demons. The careful maintenance of these texts ensured that certain names persisted across centuries, while others, lacking documentation, faded into obscurity. Manuscript preservation allowed scholars and clergy to reference established demon names when compiling exorcism manuals, theological treatises, or hagiographies. Unlike folklore, which could vary from village to village, written records provided a standardized vocabulary. Names recorded in authoritative manuscripts were copied repeatedly, transmitted across regions, and integrated into teaching and ritual. The act of preserving a text, rather than its magical content, determined which demon names would endure in memory and practice. The Vatican Library, in particular, played a crucial role in this process. By the 9th century, it housed collections of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin works, including pseudepigrapha, grimoires, and commentaries on scripture. Access was controlled, ensuring that scholarly interpretation rather than popular invention guided transmission. Clerics studying these texts could reference names, ranks, and hierarchies of spirits with confidence, reinforcing the continuity of demonological knowledge. Preservation also intersected with translation and annotation. Manuscripts were translated from Greek or Hebrew into Latin, sometimes with explanatory glosses. Scribes and scholars added commentary to clarify the meaning of names, attributes, and functions. Over time, these annotations solidified into accepted interpretations. Names that might have been ambiguous or obscure were reinforced through repetition and scholarly authority. This process demonstrates that survival depended on study, transcription, and institutional endorsement, rather than on any hidden rituals or supernatural control. Contrary to popular myth, the Vatican did not need to employ secret magic to maintain demon names. The library itself, with its controlled access, careful copying, and cataloguing of texts, functioned as the main mechanism of preservation. Names of demons survived because they were recorded in authoritative works that scholars trusted and reused in liturgy, exorcism guides, and theological teaching. By the late medieval and early modern periods, many names that now appear in grimoires or hagiographies were already established in manuscript tradition. The lesson of preservation highlights the Church's role as a custodian of knowledge. Demon names endured not because of occult practice, but because they were written, copied, and studied within a controlled intellectual and religious framework. Libraries acted as repositories of memory, ensuring that certain names, hierarchies, and attributes could be transmitted accurately across generations. In this way, the Vatican shaped the continuity of demonological knowledge through scholarship, transcription, and study, rather than through the dramatic or mythical acts often imagined in popular culture. Throughout medieval Europe, the condemnation of texts served as an unexpected means of preservation. From the 12th century onward, the Church compiled lists of forbidden works, cataloguing writings considered heretical, magical, or dangerous. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, formalized in the 16th century but preceded by earlier local lists, documented texts for the purpose of refutation, ensuring that scholars and clergy knew which works to avoid or critique. Ironically, by recording their titles, authors, and sometimes content summaries, the Church preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, including the names of demons mentioned in these writings. When a manuscript describing spirits, exorcisms, or magic was condemned, theologians often copied passages to illustrate errors and refute them. Works such as the Picatrix, the Heptameron, or Local Magicale manuals were studied not for practice, but to warn the faithful. In doing so, scribes retained the names of spirits, rituals, and hierarchies. These names became embedded in scholarly discourse, and although the Church forbade their use, they survived through critique, commentary, and repeated citation in doctrinal texts. The practice of documenting forbidden texts was particularly influential in the development of Western demonology. Clerics compiling exorcism manuals or theological treatises reference condemned works to clarify distinctions between legitimate ritual, superstition, and heresy. Named demons from rejected texts were catalogued, explained, and incorporated into teaching as examples of spiritual deception. The act of refutation ensured continuity. By warning against these spirits, the Church inadvertently transmitted their identities, making them part of the canon of demonological knowledge. This phenomenon is evident in the work of scholars like Johannes Trithemius in the 15th and early 16th centuries. Trithemius documented magical texts, some of which contained elaborate lists of spirits and demons. While he classified certain works as occult and potentially dangerous, his meticulous recording of names allowed later scholars, clerics, and authors to access information that might otherwise have disappeared. Similar patterns occurred in monastic libraries, where forbidden works were stored under supervision rather than destroyed entirely. Condemnation as preservation also shaped public perception. When texts were forbidden, curiosity grew. Lay readers and clerics alike became aware of the content and names in these writings. Stories of spirits, demons, and magical hierarchies spread even if the rituals themselves were prohibited. In this way, demon names survived in both scholarly and popular imagination, embedded in memory, because they were repeatedly referenced as examples of what not to do. The paradox of forbidden texts demonstrates that suppression can create durability. By cataloguing, critiquing, and warning against certain works, the Church preserved knowledge while framing it within acceptable boundaries. Demon names, far from disappearing, were recorded, repeated, and transmitted precisely because they were condemned. The act of refutation turned dangerous knowledge into a documented resource, ensuring that even prohibited names became part of the historical record, shaping the Western understanding of demons for centuries. By the 12th century after Christ, the Church formalized instruction for priests in exorcism through ritual manuals that carefully managed the use of demon names. These texts, often written in Latin, provided standardized prayers, invocations, and instructions for confronting unclean spirits while emphasizing caution and authority. Priests were taught to rely on God's power rather than their own, and to address spirits in ways that reinforced the Church's control over knowledge and ritual. Naming demons was approached carefully because a misused name could be seen as granting power rather than asserting authority. Exorcism manuals, such as the Rituale Romanum, compiled in the late 16th century, but based on earlier traditions, often included lists of spirits, their attributes, and the sins they tempted humans to commit. Clergy were instructed to learn these names only for the purpose of invoking God's authority over them, not for personal use or curiosity. The careful repetition of certain names ensured that priests could identify threats, follow established procedures, and avoid incorporating dangerous or unverified spirits into rituals. The manuals acted as both educational and protective guides. Training emphasized the hierarchy of authority. Priests were reminded that angels, saints, and God held ultimate power over demons. Knowledge of names was secondary, useful only within the context of formal exorcism. Manuals often warned against invoking names recklessly or attempting to summon spirits independently. This reinforced a system in which control of knowledge, including demon names, remained centralized within church-sanctioned ritual and study. Ordinary believers were not to learn names, which helped maintain clerical authority and moral order. Scribes and scholars copying exorcism manuals preserved the names that appeared within them, ensuring continuity across centuries. Even when names originated in pseudepigraphal texts or local traditions, their inclusion in ritual manuals standardized them for use in Western Europe. Manuals provided explanations of each spirit's characteristics, weaknesses, and methods of opposition, teaching priests to conceptualize evil systematically. This repetition reinforced which names became canonical within exorcism practice, while others faded into obscurity. Exorcism manuals also reflected broader medieval attitudes towards secrecy and authority. Knowledge was controlled not to suppress faith, but to prevent harm and maintain ecclesiastical hierarchy. Priests who learned the names did so within a tightly regulated environment, under guidance and with instruction on proper ritual conduct. Misuse of knowledge could result in spiritual danger or ecclesiastical censure. This ensured that named demons survived in texts and teaching without empowering uncontrolled magical practice. The cautious handling of names in exorcism manuals illustrates how church authority shaped demonological knowledge. Names were preserved, taught, and transmitted deliberately, but always subordinated to ritual, theology, and clerical oversight. The result was a controlled continuity of demon names that reinforced moral instruction, ensured effective exorcism practice, and protected the laity from the misuse of spiritual knowledge. In Western Christianity, the survival of demon names depended on careful documentation, regulated study, and structured ritual, rather than folklore or invention. The Vatican, Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, has long fascinated scholars and the public alike. Contrary to popular myths, it is not a repository of magical power or forbidden secrets in the sensational sense. The archive, formally established in its modern form in the 17th century after Christ, houses millions of documents spanning more than 1,000 years, including papal correspondence, administrative records, and theological writings. Scholars who gain access can study these materials under strict supervision, but their scope is carefully limited to ensure preservation, security, and contextual understanding. Access is controlled through formal applications, which must specify the exact documents or collections to be consulted. Researchers are typically granted entry only to the areas relevant to their academic work, and under the supervision of archive staff. Photocopying or photographing is restricted, and documents cannot be removed from the archive. Scholars have noted that even experienced historians cannot freely roam the archive. This controlled access means that what can be proven about the contents is limited to what has been systematically recorded, catalogued, and studied. Many sensational claims about hidden knowledge or suppressed manuscripts remain unverified because access is narrow and public evidence is minimal. The archive contains materials directly relevant to the study of demonology, exorcism, and spiritual authority, but these are generally administrative or theological in nature. Papal letters, records of ecclesiastical trials, and manuals used for clerical instruction survive within the collections. They document the Church's procedures, concerns about heresy, and the regulation of spiritual knowledge. Scholars can verify names, dates, and usage of texts, but the archive does not confirm legends of secret rituals, mystical powers, or miraculous interventions. The preservation of manuscripts allows researchers to trace which demon names were recorded, how they were referenced in exorcism manuals, and how authority over spiritual knowledge was exercised institutionally. The limitations of access also highlight the difference between preservation and public knowledge. Many documents referenced in scholarly works have been examined by a handful of trusted researchers, and even these findings are often published selectively. What is missing from public discourse does not imply intentional concealment for mystical purposes. Instead, it reflects archival policies designed to protect fragile documents, maintain the integrity of collections, and ensure that research is conducted responsibly. Understanding the archive's reality clarifies what historians can and cannot prove about the survival of demon names. Names preserved in manuscripts, ritual texts, and administrative records can be verified and traced through the Vatican's collections. Claims about lost or hidden manuscripts remain speculative until verified by access and scholarly study. The archive confirms the Church's role as a custodian of knowledge, showing that preservation, cataloguing, and controlled access, rather than secret magic, determined which demon names endured in Western Christian thought. This perspective emphasizes that the power of the Vatican lay in study, transcription, and documentation, not in the fantastical manipulation of spiritual forces. The origins of demon names in Western Christianity are complex, arising from a combination of linguistic evolution, historical transmission, and textual tradition. Many names trace back to Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic terms for spirits, unclean forces, or divine adversaries. Words like Shadim and Seirim in Hebrew scripture were sometimes ambiguous, referring to hostile spirits or satyr-like creatures. Greek texts use daimonia to indicate spirits that could be good, evil, or neutral. And as Christian writers translated and interpreted these texts into Latin between the 4th and 9th centuries after Christ, meanings shifted toward morally hostile beings, solidifying the concept of demons. Pseudepigraphal texts, including the Testament of Solomon, written between the 1st and 5th centuries after Christ, provided a major source of named spirits. Attributed to King Solomon, these works gave authority to lists of spirits, describing their characteristics, powers, and methods of control. The attribution lent credibility, ensuring that names such as Asmodeus, Beelzebul, and Abezethebu entered Christian intellectual tradition. While these works were never canonical, their influence on clergy, exorcism manuals, and hagiographical accounts was profound. The transmission of manuscripts played a central role in preserving and standardizing names. Monastic scribes between the 8th and 15th centuries copied texts carefully, but errors, mistranslations, and variations in spelling contributed to the creation of new names. Latinization of Greek, Hebrew, and local vernacular terms sometimes produced forms that were treated as proper names over time. Scribal practices, combined with the Church's interest in categorization, ensured that names repeated across texts gained authority and durability. By the late medieval period, grimoires and exorcism manuals synthesized these traditions. Authors and compilers organized spirits into hierarchies, assigned functions, and provided ritual contexts. Names that may have originated in translation errors, local folklore, or pseudepigrapha were now recorded formally, appearing in manuals that clergy consulted for instruction in exorcism and ritual practice. This process gave the impression of ancient, unbroken authority, even when some names were relatively recent inventions or adaptations. Saintly legends and miracle stories further reinforced certain names among ordinary believers. Saints confronting named spirits in hagiographies or sermons provided models for moral, spiritual instruction. The repetition of these names in teaching, ritual, and art contributed to their longevity in both learned and popular consciousness. By combining linguistic roots, textual preservation, pseudepigraphal authority, and ritual transmission, the Church created a system in which demon names survived, standardized, and circulated for centuries. Ultimately, the names we recognize today emerged from multiple sources interacting across time. Hebrew and Greek terms, pseudepigraphal inventions, scribal errors, translation shifts, hagiographical storytelling, and ritual manuals all contributed. Historical, linguistic, and textual evidence demonstrates that the survival of these names was the product of documentation, repetition, and authority, rather than secret magic or mystical revelation. The Church acted as a custodian and transmitter, ensuring continuity while shaping perception, meaning, and moral significance, creating the demon names that became central to Western Christian understanding of spiritual opposition. The real secret behind the survival of demon names is not a single document, spell, or hidden manuscript. It lies in the paper trail created over centuries by scribes, scholars, clerics, and translators who copied, preserved, and studied texts across Europe and the Mediterranean. From the first centuries after Christ through the 15th and 16th centuries, manuscripts containing references to spirits, unclean entities, and demons were carefully recorded in monastic libraries, papal archives, and private collections. Every copy, annotation, and marginal note added to the continuity of knowledge, even when errors, translation shifts, or reinterpretations occurred. Preservation depended on human diligence and institutional authority. Monks in Benedictine, Franciscan, and Jesuit orders maintained scriptoria where texts were reproduced meticulously, ensuring that pseudepigraphal works, exorcism manuals, and theological commentaries survived. Even when the Church condemned certain works or listed them as heretical, the act of documenting titles, authors, and content summaries preserved their existence for future scholars. Demon names, ritual instructions, and classifications were transmitted through this continuous chain of scholarship, demonstrating that survival was a product of documentation rather than secret power. Translation and commentary played an equally important role. Hebrew, Greek, and Latin manuscripts were interpreted, annotated, and adapted over time. Terms for spirits became formalized names, misreadings hardened into accepted forms, and hierarchies were established in both grimoires and clerical manuals. The repetition of names across multiple texts created a standardized vocabulary that could be recognized, referenced, and taught. By the late medieval period, these names were firmly embedded in ritual, hagiography, and exorcism practice. The paper trail also created a system of authority. Clerics, scholars, and exorcists relied on manuscripts to determine which names were legitimate, which spirits were documented, and which rituals were safe and effective. Access to texts was controlled, whether in Vatican archives, monastic libraries, or private collections. Knowledge of names was limited to those trained to read, interpret, and act upon them responsibly. This concentration of scholarship ensured continuity while preserving clerical oversight, reinforcing the Church's role as custodian of both knowledge and spiritual authority. By tracing the linguistic, textual, and historical paths of demon names, it becomes clear that the real secret is systemic rather than mystical. Survival depended on copying, translation, annotation, cataloguing, and careful study over more than a millennium. The interplay between preservation, condemnation, ritual practice, and scholarly repetition shaped the canon of names that Western Christianity inherited. The evolution of these texts shows that continuity does not rely on a single source, but on the cumulative effort of generations. Ultimately, the enduring presence of demon names demonstrates the power of the written word and institutional record-keeping. The secret is the paper trail itself, a chain of manuscripts, marginal notes, and ritual manuals that allowed knowledge to persist, evolve, and standardize. Understanding this process gives insight not only into demonology, but into the broader ways in which human institutions have controlled, transmitted, and preserved knowledge over centuries. The story of demon names is the story of how texts survive and shape belief across time.